November 1997 was cold, damp and hopeless. The air, saturated with coal dust and old diesel smoke, seemed to be stuck between iron supports and rails, rusted from the endless autumn. The Cherny Rushi station had been listed in the documents as technically mothballed for many years, but in reality everything was abandoned and forgotten here. Officially, there has been no movement along the branch line since 1988, when the bankrupt metallurgical plant stopped shipping ore here. Unofficially, the station attendant still came here every night, just because he couldn't stop. His name was Igor Latipov. He was in his late 50s, and over the years he had become like the station itself, overgrown with stubble, squeaky, with sunken eyes and a constant feeling of uselessness. In those years, many station attendants in remote areas were out of work, but Igor continued to spend the night in his booth. He explained it as a habit: "I can't sleep at home if I don't see the warning lights." In fact, perhaps he was afraid of silence. His shift started, as always, at midnight. He brewed strong tea, turned on the old radio, which hissed from every thundercloud, and sat down in front of the control panel. Of the 8 indicators on the board, only 2 were lit, the signal of the communication line and the emergency power lamp. The rest have long since burned out. Outside the window, the wind hummed through the icy wires, knocked on the shutters, as if asking to go inside. Everything was familiar, until the second when the hand on the wall clock showed 3:47. At first, Igor thought he had misheard. From afar came a barely perceptible metallic hum, low, steady, with a characteristic rhythm of wheels along the joints of the rails. He hadn't heard that sound in almost 10 years, but he recognized it instantly. Train. The real composition. Moving along a dead branch. He got up and pressed himself against the window, looking towards the tunnel, where the paths were lost in the darkness. There, on the border of light and darkness, a tiny dot appeared, as if someone had lit a lantern. Then 2. And both began to approach. The light grew brighter, stronger, cutting out the silhouette of an approaching locomotive from the darkness. Jaeger automatically adjusted his cap, as if he was preparing to receive a signal, although there had been no timetable for a long time. The headlights hit the windows of the booth, blinding for a moment. The engine hummed steadily, as if the diesel had just been warmed up. The wheels rang, crashing into the joints with mathematical precision. Igor went outside, into the icy rain, and lifted the lantern to see the train. The train was approaching slowly but surely, as if it knew where it was going. 5 cars, followed by an old locomotive model TEP-60, painted dirty blue with a white stripe. On board is the number 061874, which, as Jaeger knew, belonged to a train that was dismantled for metal in 1989. He stood motionless until the train stopped in front of the booth. The brakes screeched, and everything went quiet. There was not a single sound except the wind and the distant creaking of iron. No one got out of the cabin. Igor waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Then, with trembling hands, he climbed onto the running board of the locomotive and looked inside. A dim yellow light was on in the cabin. All the appliances were turned on. There is a steady voltage on the panel, and pressure in the system, as if the driver had just left his post. But the chair was empty. There was nothing nearby, no thermos, no bag, no jacket. Just a slight smell of oil and something sharp, reminiscent of ozone. There was a fresh footprint on the floor near the brake lever, as if someone had stood there in wet shoes. The trail led neither to the door nor to the window, but simply disappeared at the metal floor. Igor felt the cold from the floor rising up his legs. He went back to the platform and inspected the carriages. The windows are fogged up, nothing is visible inside. He pressed himself against the window of the first car and wiped the moisture with his palm. There is emptiness inside. Only the smooth seats, covered with dust, and the hazy reflection of his own face. But something in the depths of the carriage seemed unnatural. It was as if the shadows were moving on their own, changing shape, even though there was no light at all. He tried to open the door, but it gave way immediately, without effort, as if someone had unlocked the lock beforehand. The interior smelled damp and musty, like old parquet soaked by rain. The car was standard, with rows of upholstered seats, but the air inside was thick, as if stagnant, with a slight metallic taste. He noticed strange markings on the floor, semicircular footprints, as if someone had been standing there without moving for a very long time. There are identical footprints in each row, arranged in perfect symmetry. On the wall at the end of the aisle, where the route diagram usually hangs, someone has scratched the word, back. The letters are deep and sharply drawn, as if with a knife or a metal object. The edges of the scratches were fresh. Igor went outside. His heart was beating fast, but his thoughts remained clear. He turned on the radio and tried to get to the control room, but the frequency only hissed. Then he took out the emergency log and wrote down, 347. Traffic monitoring on line number 7. A train without a crew. The identification number is 0618724. I stopped at the station. There are no passengers. He hadn't finished writing the line when he heard a slight crack behind him. He turned around. Inside the carriage, the fogged windows suddenly began to slowly clear from the inside, as if someone was running his hand over the glass. Then, for a moment, he saw a shadow in the reflection. An indistinct silhouette, as if a person is standing right next to the window, but the facial features cannot be distinguished. When he blinked, the shadow was gone. He stepped back, feeling something pressing on his temples. The wind picked up, the lantern swung, and the light fell on the far car, the last one, where the sign, Service, hung on the doors. Igor came up, opened the door, and felt the air inside was different, warmer, drier, as if someone had just passed through. There was an old rag on the floor, oiled, next to a screwdriver and a key. It looked as if the driver had actually just serviced the system. But as soon as Igor bent down, he noticed a strange detail. There was a clear handprint on the metal floor near the entrance. Not oily or dirty, but as if the metal itself had been pressed in from the inside, changed under the palm of your hand. The lines of the fingers looked like they had been burned through, with microscopic cracks all around. He straightened up abruptly. The tea in my stomach tightened into a lump. Outside, the wind had died down. The whole station seemed to have ceased to exist. There was not a rustle, not a sound. Even the hand on the clock in the booth, which he could still see through the window, froze between the divisions. The time stopped at 3:53. Then, without warning, the locomotive came to life. The instruments flashed brighter, and the engine hummed. Igor rushed to the cockpit, but he didn't have time. The doors of the carriages began to slam shut one by one, as if obeying an invisible command. He heard the coupling work, the iron tighten, and the train jerked. He only managed to jump off the running board before the wheels slowly started moving. The train began to pick up speed, smoothly, without the sound of brakes, without a signal. The headlights flashed on for a moment, blinding him, and everything disappeared into the blackness of the tunnel. Only the vibration of the rails was transmitted along the ground for a few more seconds. When the silence returned, Igor stood there, not feeling his fingers. His breath was steaming, and dust had settled on his face. He went to the booth and picked up the phone, but the line was dead. The clock on the wall read 3:47. Again. The next morning, the station was checked by an on-duty crew from the depot. They found Igor sitting on the steps, with a petrified face. He didn't say anything, just repeated one phrase. He came by himself. Self. The log of technical records later showed that there was no traffic on Line 7 on the night of November 12, 1997. Moreover, there was no electricity at the station, the generator was de-energized, the wires were damaged. But the footage was preserved on the DVR tape, which was powered by an autonomous source. They show a dark tunnel line, and bright headlights approaching from afar. The train gets on the platform and stops. The camera captures the number 061874. Then, a flash of white light, and emptiness. The recording lasted exactly 14 minutes and 28 seconds. After that, the image rippled, and a strange low-frequency hum appeared in the audio channel, resembling a heart rate, only too slow, like that of a sleeping animal. Igor never returned to the station. A few days later, he was sent to the neuropsychiatric department for examination, but he escaped. They said he was seen on the old stage, where the tracks ended in a blocked tunnel. Local teenagers said that at night a metallic echo could be heard from there, as if the train was still moving somewhere deep underground, closing the circle. A week later, bursts of electromagnetic noise began to be recorded in the area of the station. Radios picked up non-existent frequencies, televisions showed trembling bands, and dogs howled while looking at the rails. People from the technical department arrived with the equipment, but found nothing. Only on the screens of their oscilloscopes sometimes appeared a strange pulsation, similar to a signal that repeats every 14 minutes and 28 seconds, exactly as long as the train was standing at the station that night. The years have passed. The station was finally closed, and the entrance to the tunnel was sealed. All that remains is an archive film dated 1997, stored under the label, Case X, 172/CR. It shows how the darkness of the tunnel opens up, and a train comes out of it. No sound, no driver, with steady headlights. The camera shakes, but the train gets closer and closer until it takes up the entire frame. Then, a sharp flash. The last shots show only an empty platform and a barely discernible word on the wall that appeared as if out of nowhere, back. Many years later, a man from the archives department told me that one evening, while watching the same tape, he heard not a hum or noise in his headphones, but a faint human voice. Very quiet, like a whisper through radio interference. He repeated 3 words. "Don't look back." After the disappearance of the train and Igor's disappearance, the case quickly moved to the archive. Officially, the report stated, the incident was recognized as the result of a malfunction of the observation equipment and a mental disorder of the duty officer. That's what they always wrote when they couldn't find an explanation. But there were several people in the management of the Northern Railway who knew that such reports were written only to keep the accounts clean. One of them is the engineer-inspector of the 4th Department, Alexander Gromov. It was he who, a month later, was instructed to check the remnants of line number 7 before completely decommissioning the site. In December, snow fell in a thick layer, covering the rails and platform of the Cherny-Rushi station so that it looked like an extinct settlement. Gromov arrived there in the morning, along with a communications technician. They were carrying a battery generator, searchlights and a magnetometer. He was informed in advance, "Don't fuss, just mark the state of the infrastructure, measure the residual voltage and that's it." But Gromov was a pedantic man. He didn't know how to just mark. When they got there, it was all the same, icy walls, rusty hands, a duty cabin with a broken window. But as soon as the door of the booth was opened, the same smell came from inside, a mixture of oil, ozone and old iron. The technician noted that for a place where there has been no electricity for 10 years, the air is too saturated with static. The lamp in the carrier crackled as if someone was moving live wires nearby. There was a magazine on the table in the booth, the one where Igor had recorded the night of the incident. The last line, written in uneven handwriting, "Train without crew." There was nothing below, but at an angle to the light. You could see another word, written with faint pressure, as if someone was scratching with a fingernail, "left." Gromov flipped through the previous pages. Everything was standard, routine, until he reached the end. The paper was slightly damp, it smelled of burning. He closed the magazine and put it in his bag. Then I examined the platform, walked along the tracks. The snow lay in a smooth carpet, but at the very entrance to the tunnel there was a spot, a circle with a diameter of a meter, where the snow had melted to a stone, and steam was rising in a thin trickle. He touched it with his hand, and the surface was warm. "There shouldn't be any heat dissipation," the technician muttered. The branch is de-energized. Gromov did not answer. He took out the device, turned on the field measurement, the arrow darted, went off scale, then abruptly returned to 0. The second measurement is the same. It was as if someone was turning on and off an invisible energy source right underground. Then they decided to go into the tunnel itself, as far as the blockage allowed. According to the documents, it was welded after the 1990 collapse, but the grate turned out to be broken. Inside there is darkness and the smell of wet concrete. The light of the lanterns reflected off the walls, and a faint drip of water could be heard in the depths. There are strange footprints on the concrete slabs, elongated and smooth, similar to wheel prints, but too fresh. It was as if something had recently passed through the tunnel again. Gromov stopped and examined the vault. Someone had chalked a symbol on the wall, a circle intersected by 3 lines, like a radio circuit. At the bottom are the numbers, 347. He didn't understand why his hands were shaking. The technician was saying something about corrosion, about plate shifts, but the sound seemed muffled, as if muffled. For a second it seemed that the tunnel was alive, that there was breathing inside it. The air seemed to pulse. When they went back out, Gromov felt that the watch on his hand had stopped. The arrows froze between the divisions, just like Jaeger's. He turned his gaze to the technician, who was standing looking at the snow, and his face turned pale. Footprints were clearly imprinted on the white surface, not theirs, but others. For rows of prints, as if someone was standing facing the tunnel. They are all the same size, symmetrical, and run in a straight line along the rails. Gromov took a photo, but when he developed the film later, there were only smeared white stripes on it, as if the light had cut through the frame. That evening, he called the department and said, "The line needs to be permanently closed. There are residual effects." He was interrupted. "I don't need any details, Alexander Sergeyevich. Just note in the report, the condition of the branch is unsatisfactory, movement is excluded." He hung up, but the feeling of incompleteness wouldn't let go. That night he dreamed of a train. Not moving, but standing, in the dark. He could see the driver's cabin, where a dim yellow light shone behind the glass. And he saw someone slowly turning towards him from the inside, not a face, but a silhouette, like a reflection of a person in water. When he woke up, he smelled oil and heard a sound outside the window, a short metallic thud, similar to a distant impact on a rail. 2 days later, he returned to the station. 1. He knew the road by heart, but now everything seemed different. The snow had turned black, the sky was as low as a coffin lid. He reached dawn, when the light was barely breaking through the clouds. The station was dead. But the monitor screen was on in the attendance booth, the one that shouldn't be working for a long time. The image was blurred, distorted, but visible, a tunnel, darkness, and light coming from the depths. Gromov came closer. On the screen is a silhouette of a man standing in the middle of the rails, with his back to the camera. He didn't move, just swayed slightly. Then a bright flash appeared in the frame, and the screen went out. Gromov rushed to the tunnel. The air there was as thick as fog. Moisture glistened on the rails. Suddenly, a low rumble came from the depths, steady as an engine. He took a few steps forward, and then a faint light emerged from the darkness, 2 tiny dots that were slowly approaching. He stopped. My heart hit my chest so hard that it hurt. The light became brighter. And suddenly everything was gone. Instantly, as if someone had turned off the whole world. He stood alone, in total darkness. Only drops of water from the ceiling are the only sound. He turned around and saw, on the wall, where there had been a chalk inscription, now a new word was scratched, remained. Since then, Gromov has changed. He was silent, working mechanically, but everyone noticed that something was wrong with him. He began to avoid mirrors and glass surfaces. In meetings, he could suddenly freeze, looking somewhere over the other person's shoulder. And at night, neighbors said, a strange sound was constantly heard in his apartment, as if a train was passing from under the floor. A month later, Gromov disappeared. In the apartment, they found a TV turned on the screen of which, instead of an image, there was only a running strip, a thin, white, like a line of light. There was a piece of paper on the table. Just one phrase. "He's looking for those who saw." In the spring of 1998, disruptions began to occur at the depot. Locomotives passing through the old sections recorded short-term interruptions in electronics. Some train drivers claimed that an image of someone else's train appeared on the security monitors for a split second, blue, with the number 061874. But according to the database, there was no such train. One of them, senior machinist Kornev, wrote in the report. An unmarked train appeared on the stretch between 45 and 46 kilometers. I was moving in parallel, but on a different line. After a few seconds, he disappeared. The level of radio interference doubled, and the instruments were jammed. After stopping, I felt a metallic taste in my mouth and a ringing in my ears. The length of the train is 5 wagons. These reports were put in the abnormal cases folder, but over time it disappeared. All that remained was the film, the archive one that no one dared to watch. A year after the incident, one young engineer, Ilya Zatov, accidentally stumbled upon the X-172/CR case file. He was one of those who did not believe in mysticism. When they told him the story, he just grinned. "It's just that the old train was pulled by mistake, that's all." But something in the documents didn't add up. According to official records, locomotive 061874 was indeed decommissioned and melted down in July 1989. However, the scrap metal shipment log had the signature of a man who died 3 months before that date. Ilya started digging. He picked up internal correspondence, inquiries, archive cards. I found out that the numbers of the cars from that train were transferred to other cars several times, as if someone was trying to confuse the accounting. The name of the test engineer flashed in the documents, Peter Agafonov, who worked at a closed landfill not far from that branch line. In 1988, he led the project under the code reverse. According to the description, the project concerned the testing of an autonomous power module based on the magnetic field of a rail line. The goal was to create a self-propelled train capable of closing an energy circuit without fuel. After the 1989 tunnel accident, the project was scrapped. All the materials were classified. Ilya realized that perhaps that train was not just an old decommissioned train. Perhaps it was an experiment that got out of control. He contacted Agafonov's widow, an old woman who lived in a village near the factory. She didn't want to speak for a long time, but when she heard the word train, her face turned pale. "You shouldn't go in there," she said. He didn't stop then. They thought they had closed the project, but the energy is not disappearing. She's looking for a way out. She said that in the last months before his death, her husband recorded strange sounds on tape, low, rhythmic, as if his heart was beating underground. And it's always the same time, 3:47. Ilya asked to see the notes. On the old tape recorder, the tape wheezed and hissed, but there was really a rhythm between the noises, 3 beats, a pause, 3 more. And then, a quiet voice, as if someone was whispering from afar. The woman pulled out the tape and threw it on the floor. "Don't listen. He comes when he is called." That evening Ilya couldn't stand it. He went to the station. "I wanted to make sure for myself that it was all just a legend." The night was still and windless. The snow faintly reflected the light of the lantern. He walked along the rails until he saw the station, the one that was dead and swallowed up in darkness. When he entered the booth, the hand of the clock stood at 3:46. He grinned, looked at his wristwatch, 2:17. So, the watch just froze from that night. He switched on the flashlight and went to the platform. Silence. Only in the distance, from the direction of the tunnel, a barely audible rustle. He took a step forward, and the hand of the clock clicked behind him. Another step and a low rumble was heard somewhere in the depths. He raised the lantern. There was light coming out of the darkness. 2 dots. They were getting closer. At first he thought it was a reflection. Then, that it was a hallucination. But the light grew brighter, and the hum turned into a clear rhythm of wheels. He stood there until the train reached the platform. 5 carriages. A locomotive with a white stripe. The number is 061874. Everything is as described. There was only one difference: the cabin light was on, and there was a silhouette inside. The silhouette slowly turned towards him. The face was not visible. Just the outline of a man in an old cap. Ilya took a step back. The air around them became thick and heavy. Then the headlights flashed on, blinding him. He closed his eyes, and at that moment he heard a whisper, not from the cockpit, but right in his head. I stayed. When he opened his eyes, the train was gone. There was only cold air and footprints in the snow, smooth prints running along the rails. He returned to the city in the early morning. My hands were shaking, but my head was strangely clear. He wrote down everything he saw in his personal journal and hid Agafonov's tape in a safe. On the same day, the electric meter in his apartment burned down, and static hissed in the radio. Every 14 minutes. That's how a new investigation began, an unofficial one, without orders or reports. Ilya decided to understand where the train was going and why time always stopped at the same mark. He felt that the story wasn't over yet. Perhaps it was just beginning. In the spring of 1999, the snow melted quickly, and with it the last trace of the former life of the Cherny Rushi station disappeared. But not for Ilya Zatov. He returned there again and again, as if an invisible force was holding him by a thread stretched between the past and the present. After meeting the train, he wasn't the same. An anxious detachment appeared in his eyes, and his movements became precise, as if they were mechanical. He recorded everything: dates, sounds, air temperature, the position of the stars. There were identical numbers on the margins of the notebook: 347, 1428, and a sign resembling an intersected circle. Sometimes at night, when the city was asleep, Ilya would sit in an armchair, turn on the tape recorder and play the Agafonov tape. And each time, the rhythm seemed to change a little: 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats, but now he could hear a short sigh between them, as if someone was trying to break through the noise. One day he realized that it wasn't a recording. This is a broadcast. He connected the old receiver to an oscilloscope, adjusted the frequency, and waves appeared on the screen, forming a steady pulse. The signal was repeated every 14 minutes. The measurements showed that the source was in the range between the tunnel and the old distribution point, where the generator of the experimental line was once powered. He went there at dawn. Abandoned buildings stood among the weeds, doors were torn off, inside there were fragments of transformers and rusty coils. There was a faint smell of ozone in the air. Someone had painted the same symbol on the wall. A circle with 3 lines. Under it, /1988. Inside the dispenser, he found a metal box sealed with sealing wax. Inside there is documentation, diagrams, calculations, reports on the reverse project. He realized that the project was not just about autonomous energy. The main goal was to reverse the signal in time, as Agafonov called it. The closure of energy not only in space, but also in the cycle of time. Ilya read everything until late at night. In one of the folders was a photocopy of a report dated 1988. During the test activation of the module, a closed electromagnetic circuit was formed. Train number 061874 disappeared within the tunnel. The signal reappeared after 14 minutes and 28 seconds on the control devices. The temporary anomaly stabilized at 347. Isolation of the site is recommended. Close the project. Ilya stared at these lines for a long time. A picture gradually formed in my head. The train did not disappear, it remained looped in time, returning every 14 minutes, always at the same moment, like a record stuck in endless repetition. But why this particular moment? Why exactly 3:47? He returned home and turned on the videotape from the archive, the one where the train was filmed. I squandered it to the end. In the last few frames, where there was a flash of light, he noticed something new. For a split second, a face appeared between the frames. It was indistinct, like a reflection in water, but he recognized it. Igor Latipov. The attendant who disappeared in 1997. His eyes were open, his mouth was mouthing something soundlessly, and it seemed like he was looking directly at the cameraman. Ilya rewound the recording. The flash shows the face again, but now someone else is visible next to it, an indistinguishable silhouette. He enhanced the frame, the contours became clearer, a man in a cap, with a worn belt. Machinist. At that moment, the lights in the apartment went off. The monitor blinked, and in the reflection of the dark screen Ilya saw movement behind him, a shadow gliding past. He whirled around, but there was no one there. But there's a smell of oil, iron, and heat in the air, like a locomotive passing by. The signal has increased since that evening. The radio was no longer picking up the usual stations, just a low hum, like breathing. At a frequency of 47.3 MHz, a pulse appeared once an hour, followed by a word uttered in a metallic voice, back. Ilya began to notice that time was behaving strangely next to him. The watch on his hand was exactly 14 minutes behind every day. The bathroom mirror showed the reflection with a slight delay, like an old screen. He wrote down everything, but he realized that the paper did not hold the information. In the morning the letters on the sheets faded and disappeared. One day, when he turned on the tape recorder, the rhythm on the cassette changed. 3 strokes. Pause. And suddenly, the sound of wheels. He froze. That sound couldn't have been on the record, but it was there, steady, rising. And in the middle of the rhythm, a quiet voice. "Are you still here?" He turned off the tape recorder. And then I noticed that there was a shadow on the floor under the table, a long, elongated shadow, like a man standing between the light and the door. But he was alone. By June, Ilya had made up his mind. He assembled the equipment, a generator, a camera, a magnetometer, and drove back to the tunnel. Everything was overgrown, but the rails still led straight into the darkness, like into the mouth of a monster. He turned on the spotlight, set up the cameras. It's 3:40 on the clock. He knew that the train would arrive at 3:47. 7 minutes. The air around them was thickening. The device began to emit voltage surges from 0 to 20 amperes, as if something was breathing underground. 3:45, the metal began to vibrate. 3:46, the hum increased. 3:47, the light. A train emerged from the depths of the tunnel. Slow, steady, as always. 5 carriages, a blue locomotive. The headlights blinded me. Ilya raised the camera, recording every frame. When the train stopped, the doors opened. Not by themselves, but as if someone had opened them. Steam gushed out from inside, and a silhouette emerged from it. A man in an old raincoat, with a cap on his head. He walked slowly, not hurrying, until he found himself in a beam of light. It was Igor. The face is deathly pale, the eyes are empty, but recognizable. He stood looking directly at Ilya. Then he slowly raised his hand and pointed towards the cabin. Ilya, not feeling his legs, went to the locomotive. Inside, everything was as described, the appliances were on, the engine was running, but no one was there. Just a chair, slightly sagging. On the panel is paper, yellowed, with a text written in charcoal, "Do not enter if time is moving." He looked up, the hands of the clock on the panel stood at 3:47. There was a rustle behind him, as if someone had stepped. He turned around, but it was empty. And suddenly the carriage closed. The doors slammed shut. The locomotive shuddered. The train lurched forward. Ilya screamed, but there was no sound. The air around them compressed as if in a vacuum. Everything was gone, the tunnel, the light, the sound, only the vibration remained. He felt his body being pulled back, as if someone was pulling him through glass. Then silence. He was standing in the cabin, but there was no tunnel outside. Behind the glass, there is an endless landscape of gray light, as if the entire space has disappeared into one horizon line. He looked at the instruments, the hands were shaking, changing chaotically. Numbers flashed on one of the screens, December 11, 1997. He understood. He's inside the loop. The moment it all started. Ilya tried to open the door, but it didn't work. Outside there is the same fog, and somewhere in the distance there is a silhouette of a man. He was walking along the rails, carrying a lantern in his hands. Igor. He realized that this was the scene Igor had seen back in 1997. Ilya is now inside, and Igor is outside. The circuit is closed. The train started moving back. Space trembled, the lines of the world shrank. Everything turned into a continuous hum. Images flashed before my eyes, faces, platforms, stations, everyone who had ever seen this train. Everyone who has ever uttered his number. They were connected like the threads of a network. And then he saw, in the center of the light, in the very center of the cycle, a machine that looked like a heart, with rotating magnetic coils. It has an inscription, reverse. He realized that the train is not just a transport. It is a container that holds a closed piece of time. And every 14 minutes and 28 seconds, he returns to the world to keep this loop from falling apart. But someone has to be inside. Someone who stabilizes the cycle. Now it was him. Outside, on the platform, frozen at the same second 3:47, Igor looked at the disappearing train. He knew that he would be alone again, and in 14 minutes the train would return, but with someone else inside. So the cycle repeated. A video recording of that night was later found in the archive. The train arrives and stops there. The camera is shaking. There is a man in the cockpit window, looking directly into the camera. When the image was enlarged, the face turned out to be Ilya's, not Igor's. And at that moment, when the train started moving, he said something, without a sound, with just his lips. 3 words. He's still on his way. In the city archives, this file was called Cycle 03. No one knows who uploaded it to the database. The contents got corrupted, but every 14 minutes the file opened spontaneously and played the last frames, a train, a tunnel, a flash of light. And on the screen, just before the flash, an inscription appeared, as if added later. The cycle is not completed. Ilya never came back. His apartment was opened a week later. On the wall, directly above the table where the equipment stood, it was written in charcoal. 3:47, not the end. Only the middle. By the autumn of the same year, new anomalies began to be recorded in different parts of the region. At night, the train drivers heard strange phrases on the radio networks, fragments of old conversations. Some claimed to have seen a silhouette of a man with a lantern on the side of the tracks. He stood motionless until the train passed by, and then disappeared into thin air. One dispatcher said, "It's like someone is repeating an old recording, but each time a little differently." And then the engineers decided, the branch must be blown up, the tunnel must be completely destroyed. The work was scheduled for November 14th, at 3 o'clock. When the bomb squad arrived, the fog was thick, and the hands of the clock on the booth showed 3:32. They started preparing, but at 3:46 the magnetometer reacted, the arrow jumped. 3:47, 2 fires broke out on the horizon. What the senior technician began, but did not finish his sentence. A train came out of the fog. That's the one. A blue locomotive, 5 carriages. He passed through them as if through smoke. The equipment sparked, the searchlights went out. And then everything went quiet. When the instruments turned on, there was no one on the platform. Only fresh boot prints leading to the tunnel. And on the wall are new words, scratched deep into the stone. The last cycle has begun. The explosion took place at 3:55. The tunnel collapsed completely. It seemed like it was over. But after 14 minutes and 28 seconds, sensors within a 5-kilometer radius detected a surge of energy, the same as 2 years ago. The one who later studied the remnants of the magnetic field said that the rhythm was repeated with minimal deviations, as if someone was still running the circuit. And among the noise of the instruments, one could sometimes hear a phrase, abrupt, as if from afar. Time goes forward, but the train goes back. So the station, Cherny Rushi, finally disappeared from the maps. Her coordinates were deleted from all databases. But on old railway diagrams printed before 1990, you can still find a thin line going nowhere. If you put your ear to the metal rail, on a quiet night you can hear a light, almost inaudible thud, as if someone is driving, but very slowly, repeating the same segment of the track over and over again. And every time, if you listen carefully, through the hum, through the wind, through the distance, you can hear a faint whisper. Back. Ilya was inside, and this became the final fact, from which there was no escape or return. In the cockpit, where the instruments continued to show the same frozen time, where the indicators trembled as if they were breathing, he saw not emptiness, but an interweaving of stories that had previously seemed disconnected. Faces appeared before my eyes, stuck in moments like photographs in an emulsion: the attendant, the engineer, the machinist, people who, out of their habit, stepped onto the platforms and did not notice how the world around them had changed. They were all connected by one identical segment, the same minute, which was repeated endlessly. He didn't try to speak because the sounds were foreign in this space. Instead of talking, there was work. In Ilya's memory, the image of the reverse project formed into a complete system, not a mistake or a disease, but a scientific gesture that reached the limit, where electronics became not just a tool, but a means of displacement. Magnetic fields, coils, phase matching, all this combined to create a dance in which the rails became an elegy and an artery of time. He realized that the train was not a ghost or a punishment. He was the anomaly support mechanism, the container that held the momentum in itself, preventing it from disintegrating. But the container was not eternal. His existence required sacrifice, and this sacrifice caused a sequence: one incoming, one outgoing, one hand remaining on the lever. Ilya arranged around himself what he could assemble from what the locomotive had: a wire, remnants of insulators, an old generator that once powered the control stands. He studied the circuit found in the distributor. He remembered the mathematics and logic that led through the thorns to the frequency that kept the rhythm of the cycle. He set up the instruments so that synchronicity with the circuit was possible, and took a place in the part of the cabin where once it would have been possible to press the lever, turn the handle, and close the circuit. He knew that any intervention would only work for a moment, that the entire circuit was a delicate balance between power and emptiness. Inside this equilibrium, one extra volt, one incorrect connection, and the system will crumble, absorbing not only them, but also any subsequent memory in its instability. He wasn't looking for approval. Fear had already reigned in the city. The departments had closed the folders and transferred the files to archives, but the archives themselves were in a state close to ciphers. The past began to be quietly pushed out of official history. Perhaps it was the work of those who had the power to lower the lid on what they did not want to see. Ilya understood that his own existence could have been erased just as easily, but there remained another requirement: the truth, which demanded that someone bring the matter to an end. He accepted this demand as a debt, as an inevitability. The next cycle has arrived. In the cockpit, everything was as usual and at the same time wrong, because now Ilya looked not only at the instruments, but also at time as a substance. The world around him trembled with each repetition, like a heart with a faint gust of wind. The train stopped, steam passed through the joints, the doors of the carriages sighed, and the same shadows poured onto the platform, where the snow never had time to melt completely. Outside, in the headlights, he could see Jaeger's outline, saw people who were no longer there and who were still there. They came in the same row, not noticing what was happening, because it had become a habit for them, like breathing. Their faces were flat, like prints on glass, and there was so much longing in those prints. Ilya connected the remaining piece of coil to a phase regulator made from the wreckage and began a procedure that was difficult to explain to himself, because it contained not only knowledge, but also faith that science could still serve a person here, and not a battered idea. He was creating a field that was supposed to change direction. Not just a phase reversal, not just a switch, but a different configuration, subordinated to the idea of not returning, but directing. Instead of holding the endless knot, he tried to form a line, straighten the loop and push it forward so that the train's thrust no longer looked back, not into the looping plot, but forward, into the time from which that first impulse came. It was dangerous. When he turned on the power, the equipment hissed, and the air around became hot. The counters blinked, the hands jumped, and energy passed through the entire body of the locomotive, as if through the veins of a huge creature. Inside the cabin, something similar to a conversation between metal hearts was happening. The contours of the field were being tried on one another, looking for a junction point. At that moment, Ilya saw an image appear in the window, not light, not fog, but a real scene from a long time ago, a carriage, people, conversations, a sound that he could not remember except as a human voice, but which was impossible in the conditions of the cycle. For a second, the world returned, and in that second, he made a decision that was not really a choice, but a step towards the edge. As the end of the minute approached, as the hand of the clock stretched towards 3:47, the voltage on the coils reached the limit. At that moment, Ilya closed the circuit, directing the flow not to hold the loop, but to equalize the phase for the exit. The magnetic field filled the cabin, and for a moment everything looked like a glass lamp, transparent and crystal. The train shuddered. Every detail, every chair, every panel seemed to recall its own story. There was a sense of free space in the farthest corners of the car, and a new rhythm appeared on the pulse of the instruments, unlike the previous one. It was a step, not a repeat, it was a push forward. But the price was immediately visible. The mechanisms craved a fulcrum, and the fulcrum in such systems is the presence of someone who synchronizes the field with the human body. Previously, this was done by a machine, but now it required a living mass that could serve as a node. Ilya understood this clearly, just as he understood that he would not go back to his old life. He felt his body bend, as his consciousness was pulled to the place where the heart coils rotate, where energy is concentrated and from where it is impossible to escape without leaving a part of himself there. At that moment, he saw how the faces on the platform tensed, as Jaeger raised his hand, but not to stop, but to let go. He saw the past and the future merge into one line, and that line stretched like a string that needed to be released. And by letting go, he became the node that held synchronicity, but no longer as a loop, but as an exit. With an explosion that was not destruction but transformation, the train moved. He moved not back and not into the same door from which he had come, but into the open space of time that Ilya had leveled with his presence. Having broken through the blockage, which seemed to be forever locked, he passed through dense layers, tore off the dust of previous years and continued on his way in a direction that was not meant for him. The field jerked, and a lot of things disappeared in this gap: sound interference, the back signal, and with them the severity of the repetition. When everything went quiet, the meters showed that the pulse, which was previously recorded every 14 minutes and 28 seconds, no longer appears. The clock on the booth went back to normal. People who once came to the station with empty faces began to lose the contours of their previous frozen lives. Someone remembered long-forgotten faces, someone woke up without explanation, someone walked around the city, feeling that some kind of lock in the world had disappeared, as if one door had closed and another had opened. But no one has been able to say with certainty what happened that night, because facts, as often happens, are governed by convenience. The archives where the film was stored fell into the hands of people who knew the value of secrets, and those folders that could be classified were plunged into darkness. But there was something else, something that could never be hidden. Those who went through this gap brought a trace with them. It wasn't in the papers or notes, but in the way people started looking at the rails. Sometimes they stopped and listened, as if trying to catch a residual rhythm. Clocks disappeared in some houses, and old radios suddenly started working in others, playing strange trills that no one could explain. It was like a fingerprint on glass, visible if you know where to look, but easily lost when trying to catch it. What remained of Ilya, except for a quiet legend, no one really found out. There were devices, circuits, and recordings in his apartment that contained more formulas than emotions. But in those notes, in the lines that he left, there is evidence not that he wanted to leave, but that he was trying to bring order to the chaos. People who were related to the line began to leave their posts. Some disappeared quietly, others left for the south, tired of fear, and others found work in other industries where the memory of the railway rhythm seemed alien. The Black Creek Station was no longer a landmark for anomalies. It was removed from maps, removed from schedules, trails were made, entrances were filled in. But sometimes, late in the evening, along the old paths, you could meet a man who, after listening to the mournful wind, took off an old bag from his shoulder, took out a notebook from it and slowly ran his finger along the lines where the numbers and dates were neatly listed. He didn't talk, he just wrote it down, and then folded the sheets and moved on. His eyes sometimes reflected what could only be called gratitude. He knew the value of the step taken by those who remained inside and those who were outside. Years later, people who knew the story firsthand spoke of Ilya as the one who closed the circle or opened the way, depending on how they wanted to believe. One street artist left a sign somewhere on the fence that looked like a circle with 3 lines, but it was quickly painted over. Someone claimed to have seen the shadow of a train on the horizon, sliding along the old rails. But such evidence was attributed to a tired imagination. Reality eventually became softer, less dramatic. People were tired of miracles, they wanted order, and order decided to hide the inappropriate. Nevertheless, there was one fact that could not be erased. Once a year, at midnight, when the clock used to stop at 3:47, at a station that was not on the maps, light flooded the rails. It wasn't the return of the train. It was the glow of steel reflecting the moonlight, as a symbol that a choice had been made somewhere, and one person's fate had become a bridge through time. The glow did not last long, and those who saw it could not clearly describe what they felt, a mixture of sadness and relief, as if something important had passed and yet nothing had come back, because time does not forgive repetition, it only forgives movement. This story remained in the records and in those places of memory where official footsteps did not set foot. She became the subject of whispers, the subject of fears and consolation, because the world, which over and over again tended to repeat itself, turned out to be capable of change. The fine line between engineering and mysticism had been crossed, and the people who lived near that line knew that sometimes the answer to a riddle is not to destroy everything, but to accept, organize, and let go. When stories settle, they change shape. Whether the station became a home for secrets, or whether it became a blank page on which someone wrote their fate, does not matter to those who lived on. In the evening, when lamps flickered in the windows of houses, and trains rolled in the distance along their routine routes, sometimes one could imagine that somewhere there, behind the filled-in tunnel, there was still a trace of a human hand on metal, a remnant of a passion for knowledge and a sacrifice made so that the world could pretend to be simple again. And that was enough.